So the most important number in the Canada-United States trade war is not 35%, 50%, or even $48.3 billion. It is 83%. In its analysis of the 2025 tariff wave, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York noted that although the United States had announced a 35% tariff on Canadian imports, 83% of those imports were exempt under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. That means the headline suggested a wall, while the actual system still allowed most compliant Canadian goods to cross without that broad duty. At the same time, American tariffs on autos, metals, and lumber continued hitting sectors capable of shutting plants, canceling shifts, and changing investment decisions. The border was neither open nor closed. It had become conditional. That is what neither side wants to explain plainly. Washington prefers the image of overwhelming pressure applied to an entire foreign economy. Ottawa prefers the image of a continental relationship being broken by indiscriminate American action. Both descriptions contain truth. Neither explains the mechanism. The trade war is concentrated inside the gap between the 83% that remains protected by the agreement and the 17% exposed to tariffs, exclusions, sectoral rules, or failed compliance. The real contest is not simply over how high the tariff becomes. It is over who decides which side of that line a product occupies. Warren Buffett warned that trade should not be used as a weapon. His method begins by ignoring the advertised price and studying the actual economics. The advertised tariff can be 35%. The effective result can be mostly exemptions, severe pain in a few strategic industries, and uncertainty spreading across every company that must plan beyond the next customs entry. When you understand the 83%, the entire conflict changes shape. The trade war is not an economic divorce. It is a fight over the contract governing a marriage neither country can afford to end. Hit subscribe because the next stage will be decided not by the loudest tariff announcement, but by the fine print determining whether 83% stays protected. Let me give you the full context, because the number is easy to misunderstand. 83% exempt does not mean 83% of Canadian companies are safe. It does not mean 83% of workers are untouched. And it does not mean tariffs failed to damage Canada. It means that during the period examined by New York Fed researchers, most Canadian import value entering the United States qualified for exemption under the Continental Trade Agreement despite the headline national tariff. Qualification is the key word. A product must meet rules of origin. The importer needs documentation. Components may have to be sourced within North America. Automotive products face detailed regional value and labor value rules. Customs classifications matter. Sectoral measures can apply even when broader tariffs do not. A shipment may be Canadian in the ordinary meaning of the word and still fail a legal test defining whether it receives preferential treatment. This is why the tariff war cannot be understood through one national rate. The United States and Canada exchanged approximately $719.5 billion in goods during 2025. American companies exported about $336.5 billion to Canada and imported roughly $383 billion. The resulting American goods deficit was approximately $46.4 billion. Those numbers describe a commercial relationship too large and integrated to stop suddenly without damaging both sides. The Continental Agreement supports an even larger system. Annual trade among the United States, Canada, and Mexico is approximately $1.6 trillion. The supply chains behind that number were not created by one administration. They were built through decades of investment, specialization, infrastructure, and repeated corporate decisions about where each stage of production should occur. A vehicle may contain steel produced in one country, aluminum smelted in another, electronics sourced globally, an engine assembled in the United States, and a final assembly process completed in Canada or Mexico. Agricultural producers sell across the border while purchasing machinery, fertilizer, seed, packaging, and fuel connected to the same market. Energy moves south, while American equipment and services move north. That integration created the political leverage behind the tariffs. Canada sent 75.9% of its merchandise exports to the United States in 2024. Around 1.8 million Canadian workers were employed in industries where at least 35% of jobs depended on American demand for Canadian exports. Washington could impose pressure on a border that Canadian businesses could not replace quickly. But integration also created the limit on that leverage. Tariffs on Canadian inputs do not remain Canadian problems when those inputs support American production. A duty on metal can protect an American smelter while raising costs for American automakers, construction companies, appliance manufacturers, energy projects, and defense suppliers. A tariff on lumber can weaken Canadian producers while increasing costs for American builders. A rule designed to bring production home can make the factories already at home more expensive to operate. This explains why exemptions became so important. The 83% was not generosity. It was an admission written into the system that the United States could not treat all Canadian trade as economically interchangeable. Compliant goods under the agreement continued receiving protection because stopping them would disrupt American companies as well as Canadian ones. The remaining 17%, however, could contain disproportionately sensitive products. Autos, steel, aluminum, lumber, and non-compliant goods may represent a smaller share of total value while supporting concentrated communities, capital-intensive facilities, and industries considered essential to national security. That is the paradox. Most trade can continue while the sectors dominating the political conflict experience severe damage. Canada's goods exports to the United States dropped 15.7% after major tariff announcements in April 2025. Canadian businesses reported cost pressure, weaker profitability, delayed investment, and efforts to find customers outside the United States. By the end of the year, the American share of Canadian merchandise exports had fallen from 75.9% to 71.7%. The relationship remained dominant. The concentration was falling. Then the agreement itself entered uncertainty. On July 1, 2026, the United States declined to extend the USMCA in its current form. The agreement remained in force, but a 10-year countdown began, accompanied by annual reviews and demands for stricter rules of origin, greater American content, and changes in strategic sectors. That decision transformed the 83% from a statistic into a bargaining target. There is another reason the number is rarely discussed. An exemption is not the same as immunity. The protected share can still be affected by border inspections, changing documentation standards, retaliatory purchasing decisions, currency movements, shipping delays, and the fear that a future review will remove today's preference. A company may pay zero additional duty on the current shipment and still spend millions preparing for the possibility that the next model year will be treated differently. The exemption protects the transaction. It does not guarantee the investment. The essential question became whether future rules would preserve the protected share, reduce it, or make compliance so expensive that companies stopped using the agreement even when legal access technically remained. And inside one North American manufacturing company, the entire war could be seen in two trucks carrying nearly identical goods toward the same border crossing. What follows is a composite reconstruction based on customs procedures, tariff incidence research, public USMCA rules, and documented business responses. It is not a transcript from one identified company. The room and individuals are illustrative. The economic mechanism is real. It is shortly after 6 a.m. at a manufacturing complex outside Detroit. The plant floor has already begun operating. Metal presses cycle beneath bright industrial lamps. Robotic arms move in timed arcs. Forklifts carry components between marked lanes. The facility assembles systems used in vehicles produced across North America. 2 shipments are approaching from Ontario. The components inside them were manufactured by the same Canadian supplier. They use similar materials, they serve the same American customer, they crossed the same bridge and entered the same customs queue. But the electronic records attached to them are different. Upstairs, a compliance manager sits beside the purchasing director and the plant's chief financial officer. A large screen displays both entries side by side. Shipment A includes the complete certification package. The importer has documentation tracing the required share of regional content. The classification has been reviewed. The supplier declarations are current. The shipment qualifies under the Continental Agreement. The broad national tariff does not apply. Shipment B contains a component whose sourcing file is incomplete. A sub-supplier changed one input. The origin declaration has not been updated. The physical product may be almost identical, but the legal record cannot yet prove compliance. The tariff exposure appears on the screen in red. The finance chief studies the two lines. Same supplier, same border, same plant, different paperwork. One shipment sits inside the 83%. The other has fallen outside it. The compliance manager explains the options. The company can pay the duty and release the goods. It can hold the shipment while requesting documents. It can challenge the classification. It can ask the supplier to absorb part of the cost, or it can redesign sourcing over time so the component satisfies the rule without ambiguity. Every option carries a price. Paying the duty protects today's production schedule, but reduces the plant's margin. Holding the shipment risks a line interruption. Challenging the entry requires legal and administrative expense. Demanding a supplier discount transfers pain to Canada, but may weaken a company the American plant relies upon. Redesigning the supply chain can take months or years. The chief financial officer asks a simple question: how many other shipments could have the same problem? The answer is not immediately available. That is where uncertainty spreads beyond the 17%. A tariff may legally apply to a minority of imports, but every importer exposed to complex rules must consider whether future shipments will remain protected. Every supplier evaluating a new factory must consider whether the rules will change before the investment is repaid. Every lender financing the factory must price that risk. On the screen, shipment A is released. Shipment B remains held. The plant manager joins the meeting and asks whether production can continue. For today, yes. For the week, probably. For the next vehicle program. No one can answer. The company is preparing a capital request for a new production line expected to operate for more than a decade. Under stable USMCA rules, the most efficient design uses Canadian aluminum, American electronics, and assembly work on both sides of the border. Under tighter rules, the company may need more American content. Under higher sectoral tariffs, it may need a different metal supplier. If the agreement is not renewed, the assumptions behind the entire investment could change before the project reaches the middle of its operating life. A legal advisor opens the latest review documents. The United States wants more production shifted into America. It has proposed stricter automotive rules, including a requirement that 50% of the value of North American vehicles originate specifically in the United States. Industry executives have warned that supply chains are not configured to meet every demand immediately, and that stricter requirements can worsen vehicle affordability. The finance chief looks again at the two shipments. One passed, one did not. The difference is no longer merely a customs charge. It is becoming the blueprint for where the next factory will be built. The purchasing director asks what the tariff saves if the company replaces the Canadian component with an American one. The domestic quotation is displayed. The American alternative costs more before the tariff, cannot meet full volume immediately, and requires testing. It may become competitive after investment and scale, but the tariff does not create that capacity in the morning. It creates a period during which the American manufacturer pays more while waiting for the promised domestic supply to exist. The room becomes quiet. 5 seconds, then 10. On the wall, the compliance manager writes the number 83. Below it, she writes 17. Then she draws a box around both numbers and labels it 100% investment uncertainty. That is the reveal. 83% of imports may remain exempt, but 100% of long-term capital decisions can be affected by uncertainty over whether that exemption survives. The plant manager turns toward the window overlooking the production floor. The machines below were financed under an older assumption. Political disagreements would occur, but the continental rules would remain stable enough for companies to plan around them. That assumption is now being repriced. The finance chief does not cancel the project. He delays approval. The company will request more supplier documentation, model alternative sourcing, estimate the cost of higher American content, and wait for the next trade review. Nothing dramatic occurs on the factory floor. No alarm sounds. No worker is dismissed during the meeting. The capital simply stops moving. Shipment B is eventually released after the missing documents arrive. The company avoids the duty on that entry. Politically, the exemption looks like evidence that the system is working. Financially, the investment delay remains. The tariff was avoided. The uncertainty was not. And that is how a trade war legally concentrated on 17% begins influencing the future of the entire $719.5 billion bilateral goods relationship. The immediate aftermath is why both governments prefer other numbers. Washington points to the headline tariff rate, the bilateral deficit, and the possibility of reshoring. Those numbers communicate strength. They suggest that the United States is charging foreign producers for access and forcing supply chains to move home. The 83% complicates that message. It reveals that most Canadian imports continued receiving exemption under the agreement during the period examined. It suggests that the broad tariff's political reach exceeded its effective coverage. It also reveals how dependent American companies remain on predictable Canadian supply. Ottawa points to tariff damage, sovereignty, diversification, and the need to protect Canadian workers. Those arguments are supported by real losses. Exports fell sharply during escalation. Businesses delayed spending. Communities built around steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, and other exposed sectors faced serious risk. But 83% also complicates Canada's narrative. It shows that the Continental Agreement continued protecting the majority of Canadian import value entering the United States. Canada was not being completely excluded from its largest market. The legal shelter created by the agreement remained one of the country's most valuable economic assets. Neither side wants to say both things at once. The tariffs are narrower than the headlines imply. The consequences are broader than the legal coverage suggests. New York Fed researchers found that nearly 90% of the economic burden of the 2025 tariffs fell on American firms and consumers. That result helps explain why the exemption share exists. The United States can impose costs on foreign suppliers, but American importers encounter the duty first, and highly integrated supply chains make complete separation expensive. Canada still bears substantial economic damage through lost sales, lower supplier prices, worker uncertainty, and public spending required to support affected industries. Around 1.8 million Canadian workers were employed in industries highly dependent on American export demand. A protected national share does not save a worker whose particular product sits outside the exemption. This is why the 83% and the 17% cannot be treated as winners and losers. The 83% contains companies still dependent on rules that Washington wants to rewrite. The 17% contains sectors capable of shaping elections, regional economies, defense capacity, and the future location of factories. Then came the most important institutional development. The United States declined to renew the agreement in its current form, leaving it operational for 10 years, while annual reviews continue. That created a peculiar state. Businesses still possess legal access, but the permanence of that access has weakened. A contract can remain legally valid and become economically less valuable. All that is required is doubt. By July 2026, The United States Trade Representative was still saying Canada had offered no concessions, despite weekly discussions. Washington wanted movement on the rules. Canada wanted relief from sectoral tariffs without surrendering control of strategic policies. The disagreement was no longer mainly about the existing 83%. It was about the formula that would determine the next one. And Buffett's logic explains why that formula matters more than the headline tariff. Buffett's first principle is to distinguish the sticker price from the effective price. A company advertised at a low earnings multiple may be expensive if its earnings are temporary. A tariff advertised at 35% may have a much lower effective reach if 83% of relevant imports are exempt. The intelligent analysis begins after the headline. What goods actually pay? Which companies can comply? Who writes the check? Which sectors are protected? What behavior changes even when no duty is collected? The second principle is that a rule can be more valuable than an asset. Canada's factories, mines, farms, and energy systems create products, but their access to the American customer is partly determined by the Usmacall rulebook. A supplier with excellent operations can lose competitiveness if one sourcing decision places its goods outside the protected share. That makes compliance capability a form of economic capital. Companies able to document origin, redesign components, and adapt quickly possess an advantage over firms that treat customs paperwork as an administrative afterthought. Countries able to negotiate favorable definitions of regional content can redirect billions in future investment without announcing a conventional subsidy. The third Buffett principle is the moat. For decades, Canada's moat was geography. The United States was close, rich, and connected. The American moat was market scale. Canadian producers could reach no customer of comparable size at comparable cost. The 83% exemption created another moat around compliant North American trade. It protected existing relationships from the full force of national tariffs. Washington now wants to narrow or reshape that moat so more production occurs in the United States. Canada wants to preserve access while preventing the rules from converting continental integration into one-way industrial migration. The fourth principle is opportunity cost. Every hour spent proving compliance is an operating cost. Every additional inventory buffer is capital unavailable elsewhere. Every delayed factory represents production, wages, and productivity that may never be recovered. The absence of a tariff payment does not mean the trade conflict imposed no cost. This is why the 83% can coexist with widespread economic anxiety. The goods may cross duty-free. The investment may still remain frozen. The fifth principle is optionality. Canada's response has been to reduce the amount of its economy that depends on one set of American rules. The United States' share of Canadian merchandise exports fell from 75.9% to 71.7% in 2025. Ottawa has pursued trade corridors and non-American markets. The objective is not to abandon the protected 83%. It is to ensure that losing part of that protection does not become a national emergency. Buffett would recognize the logic immediately. A business does not stop serving its best customer because the relationship has become less predictable. It develops enough alternatives that the customer cannot dictate every term. In more than 60 years of investing, Buffett repeatedly avoided businesses whose apparent strength depended on one fragile assumption. The continental trade system's fragile assumption was that a signed agreement would remain credible across the life of long-term industrial investment. That assumption has weakened. The agreement remains, the factories remain, the trade remains, but the confidence interval around all three has widened. The Buffett verdict is therefore precise. 83% is not evidence that the trade war is small. It is evidence that the war has moved from the border rate into the definition of compliance, where small rule changes can redirect enormous amounts of capital without ever taxing every shipment. The cascading consequences begin with automobiles. Washington's proposed 50% American content requirement would move beyond the current regional approach and reserve a specific share of vehicle value for the United States. Supporters argue that this could restore production and reduce dependence on overseas components. Automakers warn that North American supply chains are too integrated to change instantly, and that stricter rules could increase vehicle prices. The argument is not about one tariff. It is about who receives the next assembly line, battery plant, electronics contract, stamping operation, and supplier investment. The second consequence is metals. The United States has maintained high tariffs on steel and aluminum, even while much broader Canadian trade remains protected. Roughly half of aluminum used in the United States has historically been imported, with Canada providing the dominant share. A tariff can support domestic smelting while imposing costs on American companies that require more metal than domestic facilities can immediately supply. That is why the 17% can carry greater industrial weight than its share suggests. The third consequence is agriculture. Canada and Mexico together purchase more than 1/3 of American agricultural exports. Farm groups have warned that the Continental Agreement is critical not only for sales, but also for key farming inputs. A rule change designed around industrial policy can therefore reach rural communities through lost customers and higher operating costs. The fourth consequence is retirement security. Investors aged 45 to 75 may never read a certificate of origin form, but their retirement accounts own automakers, railways, banks, insurers, industrial suppliers, retailers, energy companies, and agricultural businesses, whose valuations depend on predictable North American trade. A tariff can reduce earnings visibly. Uncertainty can reduce valuation quietly by increasing the return investors demand before committing capital. The fifth consequence is Canadian diversification. The fall to 71.7% shows movement, but the United States remains dominant. Canada must therefore protect the 83% while building alternatives to it. That dual strategy is expensive. It requires diplomacy in Washington, infrastructure at home, and customers in Europe and Asia. The sixth consequence is institutional credibility. The USMCA was negotiated during Trump's first administration and entered into force in 2020. 6 years later, the United States declined to renew it in its current form. Even an agreement designed by the same political movement is now subject to a 10-year countdown and annual review. Companies will remember that. The next agreement may contain stronger language, but executives will ask whether the language survives the next political cycle. The seventh consequence is defense. North American security depends on integrated energy, aerospace, metals, communications, logistics, and intelligence relationships. NORAD does not operate in a separate economic universe. Defense contractors use commercial supply chains. Arctic infrastructure serves civilian and military purposes. A rule that fragments industrial capacity can increase the cost of continental defense even when justified in the name of security. The eighth consequence is the advantage given to rivals. China benefits when North American companies face higher costs and slower investment. Russia benefits when Canada and the United States devote political energy to economic coercion while Arctic competition intensifies. Neither rival needs the agreement to collapse. They benefit when trust becomes expensive. And here is the devastating irony. Washington's headline tariff was supposed to demonstrate that Canada depended on American access. The 83% exemption demonstrated that American companies also depended on Canadian supply. Canada's public response was supposed to demonstrate a broken relationship. The 83% demonstrated that the agreement still protected most trade value. The United States wanted to use tariffs to move factories. Uncertainty over the protected share caused some companies to delay factories instead. Canada wanted to diversify. Its economy still sent 71.7% of merchandise exports to the United States. Both sides possess the number that undermines their cleanest political story. That is why neither side leads with it. The situation resembles structural engineering. 83% of a bridge may remain intact, but the location of the damaged 17% determines whether the structure can carry its designed load. If the damaged portion contains a critical joint, the entire bridge must operate cautiously. North American trade is functioning. The critical joints are under stress. Autos, metals, energy, agriculture, rules of origin. Long-term credibility. The structure has not collapsed. Companies continue moving hundreds of billions of dollars in goods. Most Canadian imports examined by the New York Fed remained exempt under the Continental Agreement. But every annual review now asks whether the protected section will be narrowed, conditioned, or made more expensive to use. That question reaches all future investment. The number also provides a test for every future claim. When Washington announces a new tariff, ask how much Canadian trade is actually covered after exemptions. When Ottawa announces retaliation, ask which Canadian importers will pay it. When either government claims that a concession protected jobs, ask whether the protected share became more secure or merely survived until the next annual review. That discipline turns political theater back into economic analysis. And that is the final meaning of 83%. It is high enough to prove that Canada and the United States remain economically inseparable. It is low enough to leave strategic industries exposed. It is politically inconvenient enough that Washington prefers the tariff rate and Ottawa prefers the damage figure. It is economically powerful enough that both sides are fighting over the rules behind it. The trade war is not a wall across the entire border. It is a gate controlled by a changing rule book. Most goods may still pass through the gate. Every company must decide whether the gate will remain open long enough to justify the next 10-year investment. That is why the headline tariff is not the decisive number. Watch 83%. Watch whether it rises or falls. Watch which products lose protection. Watch how much paperwork is required to remain inside it. Watch whether the agreement's annual reviews preserve confidence or convert every factory decision into a political bet. The United States is trying to change what qualifies. Canada is trying to protect access while reducing dependence. The companies between them are already pricing both possibilities. The border remains open. The confidence behind it does not.
Spin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabarba mizrasta da didan shi sabarba mizrasta da didan shi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabarba mizrasta da didan sabarba mizrasta da didan shi sabarba mizrasta da didan shi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabarba mizrasta da didan shi sabarba mizrasta da didan shi صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اسه به خراب د مینې خوان شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي د برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه د برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه د برباد عبدل زرین کړما په आवाज د خالد شامل زړه پیوان شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه